Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Marhaba. Welcome to this side event at the MENA Climate Week. Today we'll be speaking about carbon removals and why that is an exciting hidden investment opportunity. My name is Christian Gevers-Duinout. I'm a senior manager for carbon removal platforms at South Pole, a global sustainability consultancy and one of the biggest climate project developers for the voluntary carbon market. Now, before we introduce the panel speakers and set out the context for this event, I just wanted to take you through a couple of household rules for today. So all of you will have been muted, so that is the default audio setting. But we do want you to interact, and there will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end. And so please do field your questions in the question box, and I will attempt to raise them to the panelists. And if we don't get the opportunity to ask them today, we will get back to you via email later on. Now, this session will be recorded and shared afterwards with all the attendees. So now that we have the household rules out of the way, I wanted to briefly indicate that for us this is a great honor to host this event at the first of what I hope and believe will be many MENA Climate Weeks to come. Regional Climate Weeks, a relatively new phenomenon, will be essential for keeping the momentum in between the COPs. And this is particularly relevant for the MENA region, where, as many of you know, the upcoming COPs will take place, the COP27 in the UAE and or in Egypt, and the COP28 in the UAE. Now today we'll have a stellar panel composed of the panelists that you see here. So first of all, I would like to introduce Talal Hassan. He's the CEO of a company called 44.01. 44.01 provides carbon capture companies with the kind of infrastructure that they need to eliminate the CO2 that they have captured by mineralizing that CO2 in subterranean stores. Now, they have the aim of storing about 1 billion tons or mineralizing that by 2040. So that's a big goal, obviously, ambitious, and that's the kind of ambition we surely need. Now, interestingly enough, we have here a company that actually captures the CO2 out of the sky or out of the atmosphere. So that's Climeworks. We have Burk Teugert, who is the head of corporate finance at Climeworks, one of the most progressive and interesting direct air capture companies in the world at this very moment. Now, after that, we intended to have a colleague of mine, Mireia Villaplana, speak. Unfortunately, she has fallen ill, so she won't be participating today. But I'm sure that with the four panelists that we have here, we can cover a lot of the good points that we wanted to address during this particular session. Now, Delia Meth-Cohen, co-founder of Rethinking Renewables, will be making a great contribution by helping us set the broader stage for this discussion. Rethinking Renewables is a collaborative program that seeks to combine or bring together and integrate the wider ecosystem of carbon removal stakeholders and help them accelerate their carbon removal initiatives, as well as initiate new ones, ultimately to help us reach the kind of scale that is required by 2030 and beyond, as we will speak about this in a moment in light of what the IPCC and other authoritative organizations have said. Now, finally, we'll end with Andrea Bonzani, who is the International Policy Director at the International Emissions Trading Association, which is a non-profit business organization that seeks to establish the international framework for carbon trading. And he will have a lot to say also about the importance of carbon trading under the recently established Article 6, or the rules that were established under Article 6 for the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, a stellar panel, as I've already mentioned, and I will try to make sure as the moderator that there is sufficient interaction between these speakers as well. And so to make it as dynamic and interactive as possible. So now that I have introduced the panel, and I hope you look forward to today's event. I would just like to set the stage for the event. And I think it starts with the grave warnings that Patricia Espinosa, the Executive Secretary General of the UNFCCC, issued right before the start of the MENA Climate Week. This particular region is inevitably prone to extreme weather events as the climate warms up. And so there is a great call for ambition in terms of reducing emissions. And the recently issued net zero strategy from the UAE is a good example of how that ambition can be put can be turned into practice. But we'll need more than reductions, and we'll need more than adaptation plans for dealing with these extreme weather events. In fact, we need to draw down or remove CO2 at a scale that has never been done before. This is a massive opportunity for the region, and I would like to state that up front. It is important that we seize that opportunity now, and ever more so this particular region. In fact, the IPCC in 2018 already indicated in their special report on achieving or keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius that the world should remove 10 billion tons of CO2 by 2050 annually in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So just to turn that into a picture, that is about double the emissions of the carbon emissions of the US today, or 4 million Olympic swimming pools. Now that's massive, right? But it is feasible as long as we do not see this as something that can replace reductions. This is carbon removals are meant to complement reduction efforts, and only then will they make the contribution that we wanted to, because removals will be key for us to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and balancing out any remaining emissions that will be there by that time, and ultimately also reach net negative emissions thereafter by actively reducing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and thereby limiting the greenhouse effect and therefore global warming. Now, the WRI, the World Resource Institute, counted at this stage, or that was recently, about 47 countries in the world that have some reference to carbon removals in their long-term climate strategies. Now, that doesn't mean that they have targets. In fact, we need these countries to also establish such targets and therefore incentivize the deployment of removals, any kind of removals, in fact, because there are many solutions out there. And they range from the more technical nature, like direct air capture, to all the way, on the other hand, reforestation efforts or carbon farming efforts, and many solutions in between. We'll touch on a number of them today. They will all have their trade-offs and their benefits, their own merits, and we'll need to apply all of them, but also in the right way and under the right circumstances where they can make the most impact, because they differ in terms of, for example, the durability of the storage of the CO2 and the maturity of these technical solutions, as well as you might expect, the cost. Now, the challenge here is how can we make it a reward to conduct carbon removals in order to ultimately drive up scale. As I said, the MENA region has a massive opportunity in this space. It's a transformational opportunity to turn this region into a carbon removals hub. There's an abundance of empty oil and gas reservoirs where the CO2 can be stored. There is an abundance of solar and wind power, and there is expertise and willingness to invest. The region has already shown this kind of leadership on CCS and climate projects. For example, think of the Al Riyadh CCUS project and the Shams Solar Park. So why not removals as well? Now, that is what we'll speak about today, how we can make that happen for this particular region. And Southpol, in this context, is an important player as we are a pioneer in helping scale the market for for carbon removals, amongst others through initiatives that we have co-founded, such as the CCS Plus initiative, which develops carbon accounting methodologies for these solutions to measure the impact and monetize that impact in the form of credits, as well as the next generation carbon removal purchase facility, where we channel capital from investors into such projects. Now, that is for the introduction and the framing of the event today. I suggest that we just dive right in, and so I would like to ask the speakers to turn on their cameras, and please all of you join me today. And we will speak first with Delia, co-founder of Rethinking Renewables. Welcome, Delia.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us today. I would like to ask you one specific question, which I believe is quite important for us to get into the right frame of mind. Could you tell us a little bit more as to where the carbon removal sector stands today, and what do you believe are the roadblocks that are preventing investments and scale up of this sector?
Thanks very much, Christian. Great to see you all here, and it's really very exciting to be able to talk about this as a sector that is developing rather than as a need that we have that is a sort of a theoretical need, which I think has been the way that people have been talking about this over the past few years. So this sector and market is growing very, very fast, and we're right at the beginning of an exponential curve. So if you look at the engineered sector, and you remember Christian said we need sort of 10 billion tons a year by 2050. We are now at around 80,000 tons maximum. So it's a lot more than maybe people think that exists in this world, but it's a drop in the ocean. So I just want to have a look at where this 80,000 tons is coming from, and this is something that's grown 4 times in the last 2 years and is growing very, very exponentially now. So let me just break that down, the 80,000 tons, so the kind of solutions that it's coming from. We've heard about direct air capture, and you'll hear from Burke later, and Climeworks. Climeworks is one of those companies with has a wonderful plant in Iceland, where they're sucking CO2 out of the air and mineralizing that. This is the world's largest DAC facility at the moment. You've probably also heard, and if you think about the IPCC report, talks a lot about BECCS. That's taking biomass, burning biomass for power and heat, and then storing the carbon dioxide geologically. BECCS is, again, on a sort of pilot scale. The largest plant is in the UK, called Drax. So those two are 2 areas, but actually the largest single player today is a company you probably haven't heard of called Charm Industrial, which is producing bio oil out of waste biomass using almond shells in California, and pressing that into an oil, putting it into old oil and gas reservoirs. They won't be the largest player for long, but right now that is the largest single player. There's also lots and lots of companies producing biochar, which is taking biomass, burning it without oxygen to lock the carbon into it, and that can be used as a kind of fertilizer on the ground. There are companies grinding up volcanic rock to enhance the drawdown of CO2, as it's called, enhanced weathering. And there's also a small amount of seaweed being sunk in the ocean to take the CO2 that's took down to the bottom of the ocean. So that's a really strange and random sounding selection of technologies that are being used. That's the state of the market at the moment. There are many different approaches being tried and tested. But what's interesting about the market right now is that there are many more buyers than suppliers right now. This is not going to stay. This will change within the next year or so. It's going to, the market is switching. But there are a few pioneering buyers that are going out there with these small bits of removals that are doing a handful of companies that are trying to meet their net zero strategies by looking at removals. Microsoft, Stripe, Shopify, Airbus has just come into this, Swiss Re, a few banks, but it's really a handful. It's not very many more than that. And right now, it's a struggle to get your hand on high quality removals, not just offsets that are on the market, but ones where that there is a sort of durable removal. And the price is quite high. We're talking about hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2. But this is what's changing. And this is what I want to talk about, how the opportunity is emerging now. And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot of growth for 4 different reasons. I just want to take you through those. The first one is that the existing suppliers, the Climeworks, there's another direct air capture company called Carbon Engineering, they are starting to scale up and expand globally. And this, I'm sure Burke will talk you through what Climeworks is looking at. But Carbon Engineering just last week announced that it hoped to have by 2035 71 million ton plants around the world. That's really a huge scale up. It's not even got its first 1 million ton plant yet, but it hopes to have that by 2024. So there is a large scale up going on around the existing suppliers. The BECCS plants that are currently this is the biomass one, like Drax I was talking about, they're ready to come on stream on a commercial way in the next few years. So we're going to have, with the players that are already on the market, a commercial scale emerging. But there's also, behind all this, a new generation of technologies that are emerging. Dozens and dozens of new approaches. I mean, just trying to keep up with what is happening on this market is really hard. It's every day there's new ones coming, and this is partly unleashed by. I've seen that a lot of startup entrepreneurs talking about the influence that the 2018 IPCC report had, talking about what is needed for 1.5. The urgency of that really got a lot of people thinking, we have to do something, and this is a major opportunity. We have to move there. Another thing that's started a lot of interest is the X Prize. Elon Musk put out a prize for innovators. You've got all these innovators starting to come up with new approaches. Obviously, many of these are not going to go anywhere, but many are. And that we're going to see, as you saw with whatever, mobile phones, wind, the next generation of technologies emerging as we move along in many, many different areas. The third thing that's changing is that standards are starting to emerge. Now, if you look at the market right now and talk to players within it, probably one of the things that they say is that the lack of standards is one of the biggest problems that they face. That standards are all over the place. But over the next few years, these standards will be starting to really merge together, and we'll come up with standards that actually make sense. There's so much work going on at the moment, and this is one of the focus areas that is needed. But if we're looking out into the future, there will be standards in the market that make it possible to unlock financing, that make it possible for more companies to be saying this is an area we want to go to. And then the fourth area of change that we're starting to see is policies. So lots of, no, not lots, let me not exaggerate, some governments starting to come out with really interesting and innovative carbon removal policies, either to incentivize carbon removal or storage, also to start government procurement of carbon removals. So you're seeing this in the UK, in the EU, in the US, but you're also seeing it in places like Kenya. And this is, an area where, when I look at the UAE, I can imagine really rapid developments being possible around, coming together with an innovative government policy that can get this market moving, and also helping then with the standards. So what is the potential size of this? We think that it would be possible to get to 100 million tons by 2030, and if you're taking that on an exponential scale, that could get you, if it carries on growing, to the 10 billion tons that Christian was talking about. So, we're definitely moving in that sort of direction. Even just a few months ago, I might have been a bit skeptical saying that, but seeing the plans that companies have now, I don't think that is difficult. No, it's difficult to achieve, but I don't think it's impossible to achieve that. And we might even beat it if policies and standards move quickly. So there are lots of roadblocks, and I've sort of mentioned them in passing what they are in talking about how they can be removed. So, there's not enough supply to get demand, there's not enough demand to get supply and financing, the standards are all over the place. It's difficult to get a clear business model. And one other big roadblock that we face is the narrative around carbon removals. The narrative is, if you think of something like let me look. If you look at the way that the climate story has gone, Christian has talked there about the need for mitigation, adaptation, and removals. But it's really hard in many climate circles to talk about carbon removals. It's seen as probably something that could block companies, stop them from delay the reduction that is needed. The reality is we need both of these at the same time. There's no, and real, durable removals are very expensive. It's not going to be cheaper to do removals rather than reduction of emissions. If we start to have proper targets in place for both of those things, there is not going to be a conflict between the two of them. But getting a narrative in which carbon removals has a clear place within the climate story is one of the challenges that is faced in this market. I'm going to leave you there, but I just think one last thought, that this region really has a lot to offer in this space. Cheap, plentiful energy, very promising geological storage options, and the ability to move fast on enabling policy. So I think that there is an opportunity here that is really great, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Delia, for this bird's eye view on the state of the market and what is preventing it from scaling up to the level that we need. Would like to ask the other panelists whether either of you have a question for Delia at this stage, and if so, please do raise your hand.
Maybe I'll just kick it off, Delia. I would be interested, since you have touched briefly on all the different carbon removal technologies that are out there. How do you look at them in terms of scalability? Because we tend to say, hey, it only makes sense to focus on carbon removal technologies or solutions that really have the potential to provide, I don't know, a gigaton or so by 2050. Otherwise, it may be worthwhile spending the efforts elsewhere. So in the air capture space, we really say, if we are not, if we are putting our energy on air capture, but we only get to 10 million removals through air capture by 2050, we might as well stop here, right? So then, how do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think because we need to really speed up the scale of this innovation, probably faster than any other innovation that's taken place, it's really too early to make bets on that. And I think also it's important to see, when I gave you that sort of range, and there's a whole wider range of, regenerative agriculture and soil and forests and mangroves and so on, there's a lot that can be included within this spectrum of carbon removals. Some of those are things that need to be at a large scale, very industrial. Some of them can be sort of more modular, and some can be really decentralized, so a lot of the soil carbon removals, which are difficult to measure, difficult to verify, difficult to work on the durability, but there are some interesting proposals coming up at the moment. Those are things that are on a quite a small scale. The same with biochar, can be on quite a small scale. So I think it's not the time now to say where we're going to see the scalability. I think it's the time to be focusing on making sure that we get the right quality, that we we understand how to make sure it's effective, that we're verifying it, that it's durable, that we know what that durability is, and if we know that it's limited, that we know how to deal with that, so that we focus on that side of thing rather than picking specific technologies.
Thank you, Delia.
And there was also just one other point there, sorry, is on when the IPCC report came out saying we need removals, all it was thinking about at the time was this BECCS biomass with carbon capture and storage. And so I keep hearing from people who know carbon removals from that, but what about all the land it takes? You know, how are we going to have food security if we're using all of the land for this? So we need solutions. Some of them will take land, some of them will take energy. You know, we need a broad range of solutions so that we're not just getting stuck with the sort of cons of any one specific technology.
Thank you, Delia. Appreciate that, and especially that message of that is all of the above approach that is required at this stage. So now that we have had a look at what the sector looks like today, what the roadblocks are, let us zoom in a little bit more into the region specifically. And we have Talal here, who is actually, on the spot there at the MENA Climate Week. Talal, can you please tell us a little bit more about what you believe that makes the MENA region so well suited for removals, and what do you believe is needed to unlock this potential there locally?
Yes, thanks, Christian, and everyone, please bear with me for noise in the background. I'll do my best. I see Andrea is also at the conference. Looks like he got a better spot than I did. So storage in MENA. So carbon removal requires CO2 storage, and there are two types of storage. There's permanent and there's non-permanent. Now, in the MENA region, as was mentioned at the beginning, non-permanent storage is everywhere here. There's a lot of depleted oil wells, and we have a lot of those here because of the oil and gas activities. However, the CO2 is there for a long time, and it needs to be monitored for life when you're using non-permanent storage. So it doesn't count as carbon removal. So what I'm going to focus on today is carbon removal. So this is permanent storage. And permanent storage is a solution much like what we are doing at 4401, where you remove the CO2 permanently. And we do this at 4401 by converting it into a carbonate mineral. So that process is called mineralization. So here in the region, actually not in the region, everywhere in the world, we have a rock called peridotite. Peridotite is typically found 30 to 40 kilometers underground. It's near the Earth's mantle, and peridotite reacts really strongly with CO2, and it reacts together and creates a stable carbonate rock through a natural weathering process, and this is what we call mineralization. Now, here in the region, particularly in Oman and the United Arab Emirates, this rock has been pushed up to the surface, and Oman and the UAE have the largest surface deposit of peridotite in the world, and this enables us to leverage enhanced CO2 mineralization here in the region. And to give you an idea of the capacity, we've calculated it roughly as around 50 trillion tons of CO2 that could be used. That's, to put that into perspective, that's almost every single emission humankind has put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So what advantages do we have here in the region? Before I dive into that, I just want to point out that this region has some of the highest CO2 emissions per capita in the world. And this is largely due to heavy industry, oil and gas production and utilization, water desalination, etc. However, we see this as an opportunity as well, because these emissions can be captured using off-the-shelf point source capture technologies, and that CO2 can be stored permanently in local peridotite rocks using mineralization, for example. The other main advantage we have here in the region is renewables. So CO2 removal is energy intensive, and when you carry out the process, it has to be done with a small carbon footprint as small as possible, so you don't end up emitting more than what you are putting away. And this means that we have to leverage off renewable energy in the process. Here in the region, we're blessed with 300 plus days a year of sunny weather, which makes solar a very strong contender to power carbon removals. We can also leverage wind, solar thermal, especially for direct air capture, and as that requires heat. So these resources are all decentralized, giving us total flexibility on the location for these carbon removal hubs that we're building. An example of what we're doing today on this is a pilot project where we're building a unit in with Climeworks in Oman, which will run off renewable energy only. The project will be completed in 2 to 3 months, making it the first direct air capture plant in the region. And I believe it should be the first direct air capture plant in the world using solar. So what's needed? I think in our opinion, there's 2 main items that we do need to unlock the potential for carbon removal. The first one is policy and pricing on emissions. If companies aren't incentivized to do permanent storage, it just won't take off. The second, again, in our opinion, is collaboration and partnerships. So we're lucky that we're working with several energy giants in the region who understand this immense challenge, and we love working with these like-minded entities. However, there are many large emitters here that don't fully understand carbon removal and why it's necessary. So, you know, we're used to hearing things like, oh, we'll just do it ourselves, or we'll look into this in the future, rather than these entities actively participating in the space and collaborating with others. So, you know, we see this as a true win-win-win, where we can help save the planet, we can help decarbonize some large emitters, and we can help make the region a global hub for permanent CO2 storage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talal. I really appreciate that, looking into the specific opportunities that we see in the region, and very exciting as well, that announcement that you just made on the project that you and you guys in Climeworks are working on in the region. I mean, really, this is innovative stuff. Now, can I ask any of the other panelists whether you have a question for Talal? Andrea.
Yeah, I'm unable to raise my hands virtually, so I'll just speak. Thanks a lot, really informative presentation, and indeed I'm here in Dubai at MENA Climate Week. I'd like you to elaborate a bit on what you would need from a policy perspective. You mentioned carbon pricing, but are there any specific mechanisms that are particularly suited to your business model and you'd like to see implemented in various jurisdictions?
Thanks, Andrea. We might have to hold a separate session to answer that question properly. However, you know, what we are dealing with is it's quite novel, especially here in the region, and just basic things like carrying out our process. You know, it doesn't quite fall under oil and gas. Effectively, we're doing the reverse of oil and gas rather than pulling out the hydrocarbon. We're pumping the carbon back in, and so the policies, the standards, the procedures, that none of this is set up, and this is one of the things that slows us down, is we find we keep getting kicked between certain policymakers and decision makers, because they feel, you know, maybe we fall under mining, maybe we fall under oil and gas. So, you know, to develop a bit more of a framework around mineralization is something that's useful, and that's also some of the work which we're doing with South Pole in this space as well at the moment.
Excellent. Maybe let's take 1 minute. Delia, you have one question.
So you mentioned carbon removal hubs. Are you talking about bringing a lot of different emitters together in some way? Is that what you're referring to there, or how do you see that? What's your concept for that?
Yeah, so when we talk about hubs, we're talking about direct air capture hubs. So this is you know, us building the infrastructure for direct air capture to scale. and having a safe and permanent home for their CO2. So we would host them on our sites, and you know, this is one of the powerful unspoken advantages of direct air capture. And I don't want to steal Burke's thunder here, but it is decentralized, and the renewables are decentralized here as well. So it just allows us to bring the tech to us and sequester in our carbon sinks.
Excellent. Thank you, Talal. And I think that's a great segue to Burke, who's here to speak on behalf of Climeworks. Burke, can you tell us a little bit more about what the potential is of direct air capture and what you believe is needed to make this technology scale?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I think the beauty of air capture is indeed the location independentness that Tala has pointed to, right? So we can basically put the technology anywhere where we have access to renewable energy and the carbon sink. That's technically all you need. And if you map kind of the locations around the world where these two things come together, you find many spaces where the technology can be deployed sensibly, if you will, and that is then combined with the fact that you need very little water. The area requirements are very low as compared to trees, for example. So depending on the calculation that you make, it's about a ratio of 1 to 1,000, more efficient in terms of space use. Delia has briefly touched upon that, but that are all very important factors in terms of scalability, we believe, because long term, probably the technologies will be most effective when they have very little externalities, and air capture basically has none, apart from the fact that the air is depleted of CO2 after having run through the process, which is of course all the intention, and that makes the technology as such highly scalable, we believe, and it can probably provide a significant chunk of the 10 billion or so tons that we require by 2050, according to what climate science tells us. Having said that, we acknowledge we probably need a portfolio of solutions. Huh? So the technologies that the has started to talk about, probably we need a bunch of them, but air capture certainly has a potential to provide a significant part of the overall removal capacity. And Climeworks, maybe in terms of what is required, has always been at the forefront of deploying that technology. So Jan and Christoph, the two founders, have really been basically moving the technology from lab scale, or from the paper work basically, into lab scale, capturing micrograms of CO2 in the lab, to grams, to kilograms, now thousands of tons by now, with individual facilities. We've inaugurated the Orca facility in Iceland, indeed. Delia mentioned that. That's capturing 4,000 tons annually. That's nothing, it's a drop in the ocean indeed, but it's all about now scaling up another 10x, and you get to roughly 1 million tons or so for an individual facility that could theoretically be then placed in locations like the one Tala is working on, but there are other, of course, nice locations in the region, because I wanted to stress from a developer's point of view one very important point that has not been mentioned with respect to the region. That is, I think, capabilities, right? So the MENA region has a lot of experience with large infrastructure projects, of course, in the oil and gas context, and that's really what you need. Huh? So the execution of these projects, of course, comes with certain risks that need to be managed well in the project execution framework, and we really need developers kind of partnering with likely large corporates that have a lot of experience in doing that well, right? Because if you kind of come from the paper and move things into practice, you will encounter challenges. Huh? So I've also been taking note of the bold statements that also listed companies have now made on air capture. It's really encouraging to see that, because we need many companies in the space. But yeah, I think everybody will need to kind of sort the challenges and along the actual deployment and the realization of the project in a certain location. Huh? So the art of air capture is all about having a good filter material, which we call a sorbent. Climeworks uses a solid sorbent, which basically done on a two-phase circle. First one is an adsorption, where we basically put a lot of air through the machine, and the CO2 is sticking to the sorbent filter material. And then in the second phase of the process, once the filter material is saturated, you heat that up. And in our technology, we only need low-grade heat, so around 100 degrees of Celsius, which you can easily get to with renewables, which is a large advantage of Climeworks' technological approach. You need to, as the concentration of CO2 in the air is so low, of course, you need to move a lot of air through. So the art in terms of the deployment is really finding a system that is capable of basically taking the air in as it comes, right? That's also then important with the project with 4401 that we're working on. It's basically gathering experiences with the subsurface on the subsurface side, but also for the technology, right? So how does a facility behave in a sandstorm, for example, a very practical example, right? So these are the learnings that we need to gather now out of the cooperation, and we can probably build on that and then kind of start scaling up thereafter, right? But it's from our point of view, makes sense to start with smaller facilities and then move hopefully faster after. That's a bit the approach that Climeworks has also taken, incremental smaller deployment steps with the potential to get to well above a couple of million tons capacity by the end of the 2030s. That's what we believe is very feasible. And then towards the 2050s, yeah, as I said, air capture can certainly provide a couple of gigatons. And also more digestible cost level. It has been touched upon also briefly, so let me mention that. Costs in air capture are too high today. There's no doubt about that. I hate to say it, but that's just a reality. But you also need to acknowledge that we often jokingly say the facility, for example, in Iceland has been engineered and constructed in the backyard of the Zurich office, which is of course not very cost efficient. I think that's also quite intuitive. And there's a lot of cost potential that we know that is available today, right? And I usually refer to it as doing good homework for the next 10 years to really bring down cost through deployment. And then you will probably see an industry rising, because that's also with the topic of the panel session, right? There is a massive business opportunity behind that can attract, is already attracting a lot of capital. I'm not saying capital is not a constraint anymore, but we might get into a phase now where capital is almost unlimited for what we do in the renewable context. So that's great, but we now of course also need to deliver against that massive opportunity. And I think it has the potential to be basically oil and gas in reverse, Tala, right? So 10 billion tons without the emissions of the oil and gas industry today. And there is a massive investment opportunity behind that. And probably the regions that are now moving fast, maybe also willing to take a few more risks than others, will prevail and be harvesting very, very attractive risk-return profiles over substantiated periods of time. And I think with that in mind, we should see plenty of companies moving in, but also governments, political decision makers appreciating the potential, because that comes with labor, macroeconomic effects, and so on. You know all that. And yeah, that's what it makes so attractive. And yeah, the region has everything that is required to get it off the ground, actually.
Thank you, Berk, for this tour de force of the potential of direct air capture, and in particular in this region. Really great to see how you're describing that move from incremental growth towards exponential growth later on, and the building blocks being put in place now. In a moment, we'll turn to the question of these incentives that you referred to already, in particular what countries can do, and what the role of carbon trading and all of that is, which Andrea will address. But before we turn to this, can I ask any of the other panelists, do you have a specific question for Berk?
So just one question. Yeah. Very interested to hear, since we have both of you on the call, and I don't want you to be divulging any secrets, but how does the business model work for a project like this? So we've got Climeworks bringing a module in, and we've got 4401 doing the storage. How do you make that work as a business model?
Berk, would you like me to
go ahead? Yeah, please.
Have a go at that. Great. Yeah. So we, as a mineralization company, we are agnostic as to where we take our CO2 from. So we just charge a small fee for the mineralization piece, and we hand that valuable carbon credit back to the direct air capture companies who've done the hard work of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So so for us, it's a small fee which gets charged, and then we hand the carbon credit back over to Climeworks. And with that, I'll hand the microphone back to Berk as well.
Yeah, then maybe to accompany then that thought. So Delia, in the end, of course, and you know all about that, we are kind of taking an externality out of the air, right? There's no natural, no one who can naturally pay or will naturally pay for that, right? So that's one of the tricky parts. And then we have because today most of the numbers that you've quoted are happening in the voluntary domain. I also personally believe we will remain in the voluntary domain for substantiated periods of time. As you also said, there is a lot of demand on that side. So that probably can take us for a couple of years. Overall, or sooner or later, that demand will also move into compliance markets that Andreas can also shed light on maybe in a second. And also governments will sooner or later play a role in the field. And in the end, the answer is that we need all of that to really get to the large quantities that we're talking about. And we need people who have really understood the topic. So what is maybe for people in the field very, very natural or trivial, it's not so natural or trivial to others, right? I'm regularly speaking to large companies, ESG departments, and they have hardly an idea. Not all of them, but you often find people who have no idea about carbon removals. And we need to go through that educational period, explaining people why to pay hundreds of US dollars for a removal certificate that you only get in 6, 7, 8 years time, because supply is kind of building up over time. We're asking for reservation payments, prepayments on these deliveries, and so on. So it's a very complex, almost due diligence kind of process that you have to go through on every customer transaction. But in the end, we are very successful in terms of contracting with companies. And basically, they pay us on behalf of their carbon emission balance at the end, right? And we provide capacities, renewable capacities over time for a small fee that is due today or later, and that's really it. And then we pay Talal for the storage services, the energy supplier, and hopefully there's a residual left that kind of covers the technology development cost and R&D expenses. Yeah.
Excellent, and I think that is a great segue to Andrea. I mean, on the one hand, we have, of course, the voluntary carbon market, and how companies or some progressive companies around the world that have set net zero targets are acquiring credits, carbon removal credits, on the voluntary market. But in order to actually increase the scale to the level that we will need regulation, we'll need compliance markets to step in, and we'll need a carbon trading, international carbon trading to play its role. Andrea, maybe you can help us a little bit in this space. Can you tell us what is the importance of regulatory targets for reaching scale, and how do you believe that carbon trading can facilitate the implementation of such targets?
Yes, then thanks, Christian. It's really a pleasure to be able to comment on such timely topics. So targets, yes, I think there's a track record that shows that regulatory targets can be successful in facilitating the rollout of technologies. We have the example of renewable energy and the 2020 target that was adopted in the EU in 2009. The adoption of those targets led to the establishment of further regulatory action in the member states in the form of green certificate scheme, feed-in tariffs that eventually led to, yes, on the one hand, the deployment of renewable energy, and with that deployment, we've had significant technological progress that led to the reduction in cost that was actually needed to make renewable energy competitive. And then less than a decade, just over a decade later, on a per megawatt hour basis, wind and solar are the cheapest sources of electricity. Yes, without getting into the detail, the problem with the variability of the generation, but this was massive progress that was almost unimaginable 10 years ago, and a target was something that spurred that growth. So in removals, I mean, we're not there yet. The net zero objectives that countries are increasingly adopting are an implicit removal targets, because I think no one can seriously argue that we can get to net zero without a significant amount of removals in place. However, for targets to function, they have to be more specific, they have to be realistic, and especially they can't be too far into the future. Having a target for the next 10 years is one thing. Having one for the next 3-4 decades is something completely different if it's not supported by milestones along the way. So yeah, that's I think targets would be useful, but I think we in the early stage, and there are a series of elements that need to be considered before really assuming that regulatory targets would almost magically provide the deployment of removals that we need, and the reduction in costs to make them commercially viable. I think one of the problem with removals and removal targets is that on the one hand, the governments tend to be quite reluctant to pick winners, especially in a space that's so diversified and with so many moving parts, so many technologies that are still at the early stages. Again, parallel with renewable energies, yes, there were still infant technologies, but it was clear what the path would be. Clearly, offshore and onshore wind, solar PV, they were at a much more advanced stage of development. And then I think the other points that it's sort of a bit of a drag to the adoption of renewable targets is what was mentioned by Delia, and the perception issue. I think that it was partially due to the way removals have been treated by some stakeholders in the past. Just putting CCS technologies such as post-combustion CCS, for example, in scenarios just to make sure that the numbers added up without serious backup of those claims with investment, with real technologies and pilot projects that could get us there. Finally, the last point I want to make is that yes, targets, national targets or regional targets are important, but removals, as some of the previous speakers made clear, removals need to be deployed where the potential exists, where we have access to all the conditions that are necessary for removals. So an approach with national targets only would definitely be insufficient. So we need markets, we need international mechanisms to make sure that we have removals where they are effective, but we mobilize capital and we impose regulatory obligations to all emitters that would find it hard to reduce emissions and would have some residual emissions in the long run. So now we have the voluntary carbon market, which is an international mechanism that functions quite well in that respect. You have global companies with operations all over the world that can finance direct air capture projects in Iceland, for example. But on the compliance side, we don't have a mechanism like that yet. As you all know, there was the agreement on the Article 6 guidelines in Glasgow at the last COP. But those guidelines still need to be operationalized, and we're not seeing, unfortunately, the necessary level of action by governments to make use of these mechanisms, particularly in the EU, for example. So I think there needs to be focus on that. The experience of the voluntary market needs to be leveraged. The protocols, the methodologies that have been developed over time can easily be approved under the Article 6 mechanisms. But what's really important is the political will to use these mechanisms and have some regulatory obligations that promote the deployment of removals where are needed, and not only domestically, where we all know the potential may be there in some countries, but may not be there. And generally, different solutions need to be implemented where they have the highest potential. So I think I'll leave it at that. Very happy to answer questions from the other panelists or the audience.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I appreciate the intervention and that connection that you make as well between the role of the voluntary market and how compliance markets can at some point or should step in in order to help ultimately scale this market. Can I ask any of the other panelists, do you have a question for Andrea at this stage? No.
I have one question, so.
Yes.
And listening to you, I hear all the things that we're going to need to do and the sequencing and the lessons from renewables. But if you take, as an example, the Gulf region now, where we've said that the conditions are right for this, what would be the first thing that a government could do that would unleash the rest of the sort of sequence, as you're saying? What should they do first?
Yeah, I think taking the MENA region as the focus of our discussion, I think the first step would be some very specific targets limited to technologies that have a strong potential, and back up this target with regulatory support, which can be in the form of a stake, an obligation on emitters to offset a number of their emission with specific removals, or it can be a carrot. In the US, there's a very promising tax break based on a ton of CO2 that gets stored, and that's effectively directly paid to the company investing in removals. But I think at this stage, it has to be the targets and incentives have to be quite specific and based on the technologies that have the right potential in the right location. This is very important. And perhaps I'll share what I heard here at Dubai MENA Climate Week. There are nature-based solutions, nature-based projects based on planting trees in Saudi Arabia, which is all good. They do good, but if I think about an efficient use of capital, well, that's perhaps not the right removal in the right place, but it's still being done. I think there are better ways to focus resources.
Thank you, Andrea. So targeted incentive schemes that ensure that the right technologies are implemented in the right locations. I think that is a solid statement there. Now we have 3 minutes left. Of course, there have been quite a number of questions from the audience because this has been a lively and interesting discussion, if I can be so forthcoming. But there's one particular question I would like to raise, which is that since we have been speaking about country targets, and we know that there will be some lag in the establishment of such targets and policy frameworks, what does it say about the kind of targets that companies can already set today that can help us incentivize the scale-up of removals? Does any of you have an answer to this particular question, the importance of corporate targets in order to incentivize removals today?
Yeah, I can maybe have a start. No, I think that's equally important. Huh? So setting removal targets. So we see companies, Neil has mentioned a couple of them who are very progressive in the space, who not only set reduction targets, but also removal targets. It's basically as easy as that. And by definition, if you want to get to net zero, you need to cover your reduction path, which is, by the way, usually more cost efficient. So we also stress reduce, but there will be a stack of emissions left that you need to, per definition, to get to net zero, remove. And you need to have a strategy of how to get there with very limited supply and so on. And there are a couple of examples where companies have really done great work. Microsoft, Swiss Re as well. Swiss Re, for example, has had this very nice tool of putting an internal carbon price into place that really is then used to fund the removal portfolios. And these internal carbon prices need to be at realistic cost levels. So we have not talked about that into too much detail, but Andrea could tell you all about it. At the moment, we have many reduction-based carbon pricing mechanisms in the markets, and we need to have schemes and pricing frameworks for removals in particular. And they come at very different price points, at least initially. Over time, they might converge towards something that is closer to today's current carbon prices. But for some period of time, they probably need to fly at a different level to really unlock the potential of the removal markets.
Thank you, Berk. Maybe Talal, if you can keep it very brief.
I will keep it very brief. I just wanted to echo what Berk said. 2 out of 3 of our advanced purchases have been from corporates who have really strict carbon removal targets. So that will help us drive down the cost and increase the scale. So it's really important at the early stage to have that kind of support.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Talal and Berk, for answering this question. Let me just briefly wrap this up before we ask everybody to continue with their day. So, I mean, there have been a couple of clear messages here, right? One is the massive challenge before us that the quest for carbon removals poses. But at the same time, there is an immense opportunity, and that is very specific or particular to this region. There's so much abundance of renewable energy power. There are stores everywhere where CO2 can be stored permanently, and there's lots of expertise and willingness to invest in new solutions. Now, putting all of that together creates a very positive environment to scale removals in the MENA region. So now what we need is the incentives, right? And these incentives, as has been said at the end, they can come about also before we allow removals to be taken up into compliance schemes. The voluntary market can do a lot, and companies can be progressive and set their own targets, especially if they're aiming for net zero, which has implications for the amount of removals that should be part of it. And I think that is the kind of point where we can end today's discussion. Major challenge, immense potential. Now we need the incentives. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this interesting discussion. We look forward to continuing it in the future. Thank you to all the panel speakers for your intervention. It has been a great pleasure, and I wish you a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks, Christian. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.